Quad 6'6".
I'm tapping right here.
Okay, so curiosity got the best of me. I am going deeper and ever deeper on this comparison between these Flywoo and FPVcycle motors. You know, on paper it's the same motor. It's a 1202.5, both listed as 11,500 kV. But both objectively and also from what I feel in the air, I feel like these motors are quite different, surprisingly. So objectively, from the thrust stand data, we know the FPVcycle motor generates a little bit more thrust at the top end. We also know across the board it does it a little bit more efficiently. The part that we're missing from the thrust data, though, is the transient response, or the transition time, however you want to call it. And that's the time it takes when, for example, you're trying to go from one thrust level to another. And so instead of looking at, so the thrust data that we have so far is just static, meaning it's at equilibrium. So once you're at that level, what's it doing? But we don't have the change from one level to the next. And that's where I feel that the FPVcycle motor has a little bit of a weakness and that Flywoo motor is better. What I feel when I'm flying is that the Flywoo motor is quite a bit more responsive, particularly when I'm pitch and roll and response like that. And to me, it makes it for a more enjoyable motor, but it does that at the expense of a little bit loss of the top end and also a little bit of loss of efficiency. And so trying to figure out what these motors, how they're different, I did in that last video, I did the switch. So I took the Flywoo bell and put it on the FPVcycle stator, and then vice versa, the FPVcycle bell on this Flywoo stator. And what I found in the air, and it was I didn't do a whole bunch of testing with it that way, but to me it felt like the responsiveness traveled with both the bell and the stator, meaning that it felt like there's some difference in the bell, because when I put the Flywoo bell onto that FPVcycle stator, I felt that I increased responsiveness. And then when I went ahead and put the FPVcycle bell onto the Flywoo stator, it felt like I had more responsiveness out of that combination than I did with the FPVcycle bell and stator. So, before I've tried to look at the magnets and the gaps, and it's really hard to tell much of a difference. Plus, the construction is a little bit different, where these where the FPVcycle motors made by RCN Power have this C-ring, so you can't really see the magnets quite as well. It makes it a little bit harder to compare them. And so in this one, I went ahead and stripped down a couple stators to see, can we see any difference? In both cases, I found that these are 5-turn, and they're double, so it's double-stranded, and I can't tell any difference between the gauge of the wire. To me, that looks like they went ahead and spec'd the same gauge wire. But what's a little bit interesting, and maybe is a little bit of a clue, or it's just a red herring, is that when you look at the total length of the wires, it's been consistent that the Flywoo length of the wires is just a tiny bit longer than the FPVcycle motor. And that could be for a couple of reasons. That could be because maybe that FPVcycle is doing a little better job winding the motors, and so it's a little tighter. Or it could be that it just actually takes a little bit of more length in the wire to actually wrap around the stators. And so if I'm kind of like having to pick between these two, and it could be just the coating, the insulating coating on it, but I would say maybe you could convince me that the Flywoo stator is a little bit different, that maybe it's a little bit girthier looking than the FPVcycle. Maybe there's a tiny bit more iron in there. I don't know though. That's to me, like, that's pretty hard to say whether that's a real difference or not, or that's just me kind of projecting on it. In terms of the actual height and width on this magnet facing portion of the stator, to me again they look very, very similar. I'm trying to get it real nice and lined up there. Sometimes I feel like maybe the FPVcycle motor is a little bit touch narrower, but then I kind of go to a different part and then I'm like, then I think, no, I don't know, maybe. Anyways, there could be a tiny bit of difference there. But what I'm left with, and I'd really like to see the actual KV testing on these motors. So it's actually KV tested. What you would want to do is you want to put it in something like a drill press where you can control the RPM, spin them at both the same RPM, and then measure the voltage. And I think that would tell us, it would confirm or kind of refute whether one of these motors has a little bit better magnetic field. So what would happen is whichever motor, so when you're spinning them at the same efficiency, we know they have the same number of winds. So then the difference is going to be down to the magnets in the stator. And so if we go ahead and spin them at the same RPM, then whichever one has the higher strength magnets and tighter air gaps, more iron in the stator, that one will produce more voltage. And that will mean that the one that has a stronger magnetic field is actually going to have a slightly lower KV, meaning that for a given voltage, it's going to spin a little bit slower. And it's kind of funny when you think about it that way. It feels a little backwards. It's like, wait, why is the stronger one spinning slower for a given voltage? Well, it makes more sense if you're making the electricity out of the motor. If you're spinning the motor, it's easier for your brain to comprehend. Oh yeah, so if I'm spinning the motor and I'm making the electricity, the one with the better magnets, the better stator, is going to produce more voltage. That makes a little bit more sense. And so what I think is happening, and I'd really love to see the objective testing to kind of corroborate this, is that I think what we're experiencing here is that whatever it is, whether it's the magnet or the stator, we know it's not the number of turns, that we've got the same number of turns, and that wire difference, actually the slight length difference, maybe that plays a slight factor. But what I think is happening is that the FPV or the Flywoo motor has a slightly stronger magnetic field, and what that means is that its effective KV, its actual KV is going to be just a touch lower than the FPVcycle motor, and it's going to give up a little bit of efficiency. But what it's going to give us is a little bit better transient response. It's going to be able to change thrust a little bit quicker and be a little bit more responsive, and I think that's the trade-off. And anyways, that's what I could find. So I think I went about as deep on this review as you possibly can without getting some extra equipment and doing some testing, but I don't know. I think it's really interesting. And it also kind of speaks to the idea that, like, just how hard is it to like tune these motors and get the properties you want. If these motors are like this similar and produce a different feel in the air, that to me is kind of mind-boggling and wild, that you could try and spec motors out so closely and end up in a different place than you expected. So that kind of gives me a little bit of respect, better appreciation for people trying to design motors and how challenging it is and how much interaction there is. All right.
Till next time. Cheers.
Thank you, Ryder.